Picture this: a grand hall draped in velvet, the air thick with the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine, where every bite served at the royal table was a carefully crafted cipher. This wasn't just a feast, it was a battlefield of whispers where food became the ultimate tool of diplomacy. Kings and queens didn't just eat to indulge, they dined to deceive, to flatter, or even to threaten, all without uttering a single word. Hidden in the swirl of a sauce or the arrangement of a platter lay messages meant only for the most discerning eyes. These were the lost recipes of power, where culinary artistry doubled as political strategy, and tonight we're pulling back the curtain on 25 of the most astonishing examples. Think of the most elaborate dinner party you've ever attended, now multiply it by 1,000. In the medieval world, banquets were spectacles of wealth and influence, but beneath the gilded surface, they were also masterclasses in subterfuge. A single dish could announce an alliance, a subtle shift in ingredients might hint at betrayal, and the choice of which guest received the rarest delicacy. That was a statement louder than any proclamation. These recipes weren't just lost to time, they were deliberately buried, their secrets guarded like state secrets. But now, centuries later, we're deciphering them, unraveling the coded language of saffron, sugar, and spice that shaped empires. So why does this matter today? Because food has always been more than sustenance. It's a mirror of the human story. Every recipe we'll explore is a snapshot of ambition, fear, and ingenuity, a reminder that even the most lavish feast could be a chessboard in disguise. From the symbolic use of pomegranates to declare fertility and strength, to the shocking ingredient substitutions that signaled covert rebellions, these dishes are time capsules of intrigue. And as we journey through each one, you'll start to see history's grandest feasts in a whole new light, not just as celebrations, but as carefully staged performances where every course was a line in a hidden script. Ready to uncover the secrets, let's begin. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval banquet hall, even the humblest loaf of bread could carry the weight of a throne's intentions. Take the art of gifting food. What might seem like a simple gesture was often a high-stakes game. When King Richard II of England sent barrels of his finest wine to a visiting French delegation, it wasn't just hospitality, it was a flex of economic power, a silent reminder of England's thriving trade networks. But the true masters of this culinary chess game were the Byzantine emperors who turned dessert into diplomacy. Their famed golden sugar sculptures, shaped like rival kingdoms' crests, would be served to foreign ambassadors only to be dramatically shattered by the emperor's own hand, a not-so-subtle metaphor for imperial dominance. And then there were the ingredients themselves, each one a loaded symbol. Almonds, for instance, were currency in the language of courtship. When Elena of Aquitaine included them in a feast for her estranged husband Louis VII, their sweetness was a public olive branch. But swap those almonds for bitter herbs, and suddenly the message turned icy. The Florentine archives reveal how the Medici family would alter a single spice in a visiting dignitary's dish, a dash less cinnamon, perhaps, to signal displeasure without risking outright war. These weren't recipes, they were psychological operations plated on gold trenchers. Perhaps most fascinating were the cipher courses, where entire menus formed acrostics. At one 15th century Burgundian feast, the first letters of each dish spelled out a Latin warning to rebellious nobles, a culinary crossword only the literate elite could decode. Even the placement of food held meaning. Serving venison to a guest of lower rank than the host was an unforgivable insult, while offering the liver believed to hold courage was tantamount to a military alliance. Every bite was a binding contract, every sip a signed treaty. What makes these culinary codes so extraordinary is their universality, from the saffron-infused rice dishes of Persian shahs to the boar's head centerpieces of English Yuletide feasts. Food became a shared language of power. A language where peppercorns could outline borders and the freshness of fish could determine the fate of dynasties. This was politics you could taste, a world where the sharpest weapon wasn't a sword, but a well-timed tart. Nothing commanded attention at a medieval banquet quite like the resurrection of a peacock, roasted to perfection, then meticulously recloaked in its own iridescent plumage, standing proud as if still alive. This wasn't just culinary theater, it was a throne room on a platter. The bird's mythical association with immortality legend claimed its flesh never decayed made it the ultimate symbol of a ruler's divine right. When a king presented this dish, he wasn't just serving meat, he was serving a manifesto. My power is as eternal as this bird's splendor, but the true genius lay in the dish's duality. To guests loyal to the crown, the peacock's grandeur was a reward, its shimmering feathers reflecting their privileged place at the monarch's table, yet for those nursing rebellious thoughts. The message turned razor sharp. The meticulous process of skinning, roasting, and re-feathering the bird mirrored the fate awaiting traitors, stripped of status, humiliated, then paraded as a warning. Historical accounts from the court of Henry V reveal how the peacock's head would often be gilded, not just for opulence but to evoke the crown itself, a reminder that defiance meant challenging divinity. The preparation itself was a ritual of dominance. Only the royal kitchen staff knew the secret technique to keep the feathers from burning during roasting, a closely guarded metaphor for the ruler's ability to preserve order amid chaos. Some recipes even called for stuffing the bird with spices from the East: pepper, cloves, saffron, each one a not-so-subtle nod to the monarch's global trade networks and military reach. And when the peacock was carried into the hall atop a shield by the head chef, its tail fanned in defiance of gravity, the spectacle reached its peak. The dish wasn't carved with a knife, but with a ceremonial sword, turning supper into a coronation. What makes this recipe so chillingly effective was its universality as propaganda. From the courts of Aragon to the feasts of Burgundy, variations of the peacock dish reinforced the same lesson. Power wasn't just held, it was performed. Even the bird's notorious toughness as meat played a role. Guests were expected to chew through the challenge, a physical act of submission, and if anyone missed the symbolism. The final act drove it home. The peacock's beak would sometimes be set aflame with brandy, a miniature pyre warning that rebellion burned bright but brief. Here, in the golden glow of that spectacle, every guest understood loyalty wasn't requested. It was ingested. Imagine a sculpture so delicate it could melt in sunlight, crafted not from marble but from pure sugar, a swan with wings arched in mid-flight, its every feather painstakingly shaped by royal confectioners. This wasn't just dessert, it was the ultimate peace offering, a masterpiece of diplomacy meant to dissolve on the tongue. Medieval subtleties like this swan were the edible equivalent of a handshake between kingdoms, where sugar became the sweet glue binding political futures. At royal weddings, the swan's presence was no accident, its long neck entwined with ribbons of spun sugar, mirroring the alliance being forged between two crowns. But beneath the gilded surface lay a darker truth. The sweeter the sculpture, the more bitter the negotiations that preceded it. The creation of these sugar swans was itself a high-stakes performance. Master confectioners, often sworn to secrecy, would work for weeks in guarded kitchens, boiling syrup to precise temperatures, molding it into fragile curves that could shatter with a misplaced breath. The swan's purity, its unblemished white surface, was a carefully constructed illusion, just like the treaties it represented. Historical records from the court of Henry VI reveal how the sugar itself was a flex of wealth, imported at staggering cost from Cyprus or Sicily. It signaled that a kingdom could afford such extravagance even amid war. And when the swan was presented, its base often bore intricate sugar replicas of the couple's coats of arms, a silent proclamation that love, like politics, was a merger of resources. But the true power of this recipe lay in its destruction. The moment the swan was broken, usually by the joined hands of the bride and groom, was the edible equivalent of signing a contract. In one infamous case, when the Duke of Burgundy hesitated to fracture the swan at his daughter's wedding to a Habsburg prince, the tension in the hall grew palpable. His eventual compliance, recorded by a chronicler as "the sigh heard round the court," marked the reluctant acceptance of Habsburg influence. The act was so symbolic that fragments of the shattered sculpture would be distributed to guests as edible souvenirs, turning every guest into a witness to the pact. Yet the swan's sweetness could also be a weapon. When Anne of Brittany served miniature sugar swans to French envoys during independence talks, their delicate wings were deliberately misshapen, a coded message that a Breton duchy wouldn't be so easily molded to Paris will. Other courts took the metaphor further. The Milanese Sforza family once sent a swan with a broken neck to a rebellious vassal, its collapse prearranged to mimic the consequences of disloyalty. The recipe books of the time even included instructions for mourning swans, dyed black with burnt sugar, served at funerals or to mark the dissolution of alliances. What makes these sugar sculptures so mesmerizing is their duality. They were both art and artifice, celebration and calculation. A single swan could carry the hopes of a nation or the veiled threat of its wrath, all while masquerading as mere ornament. And long after the last crumb dissolved, the message remained. In the medieval world, even sweetness came with strings attached. The boar's head arrived not on a platter, but atop a shield, its tusks gleaming like daggers in the torchlight, a silent proclamation that tonight's feast was anything but peaceful. In the medieval world, where every gesture carried weight, this dish was less a meal and more a declaration of war served cold. The beast's unblinking stare met each guest as the platter was paraded around the hall, its presence alone enough to make allies sit taller and rivals shift uneasily in their seats. This wasn't just a centerpiece, it was a challenge carved in cartilage and sinew, a relic of hunting traditions twisted into political theater. What made the boar's head so potent was its dual symbolism. To the Norse, it represented the sacred beast Gullinbursti, a creature of fertility and protection. But when served by a king to his vassals, it morphed into something far sharper. The act of hunting the boar, a creature known for its viciousness, mirrored the monarch's ability to tame chaos. At the court of Charlemagne, serving the head intact with its hide was a not-so-subtle reminder that the ruler had survived the wilderness of power struggles, and so too would his guests if they stayed loyal. Yet when the Duke of Normandy once sent a boar's head to the French king with its ears conspicuously notched, the message was clear: "I've marked your territory, and I'm not afraid to take more." The preparation itself was a ritual of intimidation. Historical kitchen manuscripts reveal how the head would often be boiled with vinegar and steel blades in the cauldron, a literal and metaphorical sharpening of edges. Some recipes even called for stuffing the beast's mouth with its own minced heart, a visceral metaphor for consuming one's defiance and the moment of carving. That was when the real performance began. The host would rise, knife in hand, and slice the jowls with exaggerated precision, offering the first cuts to those he wished to honor or to those he wished to humble. A surviving account from the Plantagenet court describes how Henry II once served the tongue to a disgraced earl with the chilling remark, "Perhaps this will loosen yours in confession." But the true brilliance of this dish lay in its adaptability. In Scandinavia, a boar's head garnished with holly became a Yuletide tradition masking a darker history. The holly's prickly leaves echoed the oath of the boar, a Viking-era pledge of loyalty sealed over such a feast. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, Moorish chefs would glaze the head with honey and rosewater, transforming it into a backhanded compliment, sweet on the surface, ferocious beneath. The Florentines took it further, crafting boars' heads from marzipan for diplomatic gifts, their delicate appearance belying the iron fist inside. Perhaps no moment captures the dish's political potency better than the infamous Boar's Head Banquet of 1483, when the King of Hungary served 7 heads, one for each rebellious noble, each positioned to face the guest it represented. As the feast progressed, servants would gradually turn the heads away from the table, a slow-motion spectacle of disfavor that left no doubt where power lay. By dessert, only 3 heads still faced the host. The rest, like their living counterparts, had been symbolically exiled. This was food as psychological warfare, where every bite demanded a response. To refuse the boar's meat was an insult, to accept it without hesitation, a submission, and for those who dared to request the tusks as a trophy, that was a gambit only the bravest or most foolish would attempt. In the end, the boar's head wasn't just served to be eaten, it was served to be remembered, its message lingering long after the bones were cleared. In the Game of Thrones, even dinner could draw blood. On the surface, a simple Lenten meal of fish seemed like humble obedience to church doctrine, but in royal kitchens, even piety could be plated for power. When the 40 days of Lent stripped meat from every table in Christendom, kings turned to the sea for a different kind of conquest. The rarer the fish, the louder the message. A sturgeon hauled from the Baltic or a lamprey shipped live from Portugal wasn't just sustenance, it was a flex of economic reach and naval might. At the court of Henry VIII, where meat was synonymous with masculine vigor, the sudden shift to fish could have been seen as weakness. Instead, his chefs transformed it into spectacle, serving up silver-scaled power plays that left ambassadors speechless. Consider the lamprey, a slithering, eel-like creature so prized it sparked international incidents. When King John of England received 12 lampreys as a gift from Normandy, their arrival was logged in royal accounts like captured treasure. But when those same fish appeared at a Lenten feast for French diplomats, their preparation told another story. Poached in Hippocrates wine infused with cinnamon and cloves, spices so expensive they outweighed the fish's value. This wasn't fasting, it was financial warfare on fine china, proving England could burn fortunes on a single dish while rivals pinched pennies. The true genius of these fish feasts lay in their dual allegiance. By adhering strictly to Lent's rules, no meat, no dairy, monsters wrapped themselves in virtue. Pope Pius II once wrote of being served a pike so large it required 2 servants to carry it, its gills stuffed with saffron breadcrumbs to mimic the papal tiara. The message, even God's representative on earth dined at the pleasure of temporal power. Meanwhile, in Venice, the Doge turned Lent into a maritime propaganda machine, serving turbot arranged in the shape of the city's lion crest, each flake of flesh a reminder that Venice's true religion was trade. But the masterstroke came from the kitchens of Castile, where chefs weaponized abstinence itself. When Queen Isabella needed to humble a boastful cardinal, she served him a dish of salted cod, the cheapest, toughest fish available, while the rest of the court dined on trout stuffed with crab. The cardinal's portion, soaked not once but 3 times to remove excess salt, was a culinary penance, a reminder that even princes of the church answered to crowns. Records show similar tactics in Portugal, where explorers' maps doubled as menus serving newly discovered species from Africa's coast was an edible demonstration of colonial reach. What makes these Lenten recipes so fascinating is their contradiction. They followed scripture to the letter while violating its spirit entirely, turning self-denial into self-aggrandizement. A French treatise from 1516 even advised rulers to stock their ponds with carp specifically for Lent, breeding them in colors that matched their coat of arms. By the time dessert arrived, gilded jellyfish shaped like saints, or almond milk custard stamped with royal seals, the lesson was clear. In the medieval world, even fasting could be a feast for the eyes, and piety was just another dish to be seasoned to taste. Red, simple, everyday bread transformed into something celestial when medieval bakers brushed its crust with sheets of edible gold, turning a staple of peasant diets into a coronation on a platter. This wasn't food, it was alchemy, a deliberate blurring of the line between mortal and divine. When Byzantine emperors served golden loaves to their guests, each shimmering slice was a silent sermon. If God grants me the wealth to gild bread, who are you to question my reign? The extravagance was dizzying. Records from Constantinople's kitchens note that a single banquet might use gold leaf worth a village's annual harvest, all to prove a point that required no words. The ritual of breaking this bread carried even heavier symbolism. Unlike coarse rye or barley loaves torn apart by calloused hands, golden bread demanded ceremony. At the court of Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, the loaf would be presented on a silver salver, its crust scored with crosses that split perfectly when pulled apart, a not-so-subtle nod to the ruler's dual role as both earthly and spiritual authority. Guests who received a portion weren't just eating, they were participating in a sacrament of sovereignty, and woe to anyone who refused it. When a Venetian ambassador once declined, citing humility, Frederick's chancellor famously retorted, "Then you decline the light of heaven that shines through our Lord." But the true genius of this recipe lay in its exclusivity. Gold leaf bread couldn't be counterfeited. The cost alone made it impossible for upstart nobles to replicate. In England, Henry IV used it as a weapon during the Percy's Rebellion, hosting a feast where golden bread was served only to loyalists. Rebels got plain wheat, a culinary demotion that stung more than any battlefield loss. The message was clear. Legitimacy wasn't just claimed, it was baked, gilded, and consumed. Even the church played along, with papal bulls explicitly blessing the use of edible gold in royal kitchens, effectively turning kitchens into extensions of the altar. Perhaps no moment captures the bread's political theater better than the Feast of the Gilded Crumb in 1420, when the Burgundian Duke Philip the Good served golden bread studded with pearls. As guests gasped, he plucked a pearl from his own slice and dropped it into a goblet of wine, a stunt meant to mirror the biblical parable of the pearl of great price. The lesson: his rule was worth every jewel. Yet the stunt backfired when his rival, the French king, retaliated by serving bread gilded not just on the outside, but layered with gold throughout the dough. A hidden extravagance, proving true power didn't need to flaunt itself. What makes this recipe so fascinating is its lingering legacy. Today's gold-dusted desserts and champagne flutes trace straight back to these medieval theatrics, proof that the language of edible luxury still whispers of power. But in an age when kings believed divinity could be baked into a loaf, every glittering crumb was a commandment. Challenge this rule, and you challenged heaven itself. The goblet passed between monarchs wasn't just filled with wine. It brimmed with the essence of empires, steeped in spices so precious they could ransom castles. This was the spiced wine of alliance, a drink so politically charged that every sip was a silent treaty. Picture the scene: two rulers, their armies camped beyond the castle walls, seated at a table where the scent of cloves and cardamom hung heavier than the threat of swords. The act of blending wine with exotic spices, pepper from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, wasn't just culinary flair, it was a metaphor-writ liquid. Just as these flavors fused seamlessly, so too could their kingdoms, if only for this fragile moment. The ritual began long before the wine touched lips. Byzantine emperors would have their cupbearers taste the spices openly, proving no poison lurked beneath the sweetness. In one notorious incident from the Crusader states, a knight's refusal to drink from a shared vessel nearly sparked a battle, until the host drained the goblet himself, turning suspicion into shame. But the true artistry lay in the recipe's variations. When Elena of Castile served wine infused with rosewater and honey to English envoys, the floral notes were no accident. They echoed the gardens of her homeland, a subtle reminder that a dowry included vast tracts of fertile land. Conversely, the Venetians would spike their diplomatic wine with ginger, a spice that burned the throat on the way down, a not-so-subtle nod to the sting of their trade terms. What made this drink so potent was its dual nature. The same wine that toasted weddings could also seal surrenders. After the Battle of Agincourt, chroniclers describe Henry V serving his defeated French captives wine spiced with anise, a flavor believed to aid digestion, implying their rebellion was merely indigestion to be soothed. Meanwhile, in the East, Mongol Khans would serve fermented mare's milk with pepper to ambassadors, the combination so alien to European palates that drinking it without flinching became a test of diplomatic mettle. The spices themselves were geopolitical chess pieces. When Portugal's Manuel I sent ships around Africa to control the spice trade, his first act was to serve cinnamon wine to Spanish diplomats, a liquid boast that Lisbon now held the keys to flavors Madrid could no longer access. Recipes from the time show how the balance of ingredients mirrored power dynamics, more saffron than pepper for an equal alliance, but heavy on the peppercorns when signaling dominance. And woe to the host who got the blend wrong. In 1489, a Florentine envoy nearly lost his head after serving wine with insufficient nutmeg to the Duke of Milan, an oversight interpreted as contempt. Perhaps no moment captures the wine's symbolic weight better than the Goblet of Two Kings ceremony, where the Holy Roman Emperor and the French monarch would drink from a double-spouted vessel. The first sip synchronized, the second staggered, a choreographed dance of trust and caution. The vessel itself, often crafted from rock crystal to show clarity or lack thereof of the wine, became a relic displayed in treasuries long after the liquid evaporated. This was diplomacy decanted, a drink that could dissolve borders or harden them, all in the time it took to raise a cup. And when the last drop was drained, the dregs told their own story. Spices settled in patterns that court astrologers would read like tea leaves, predicting the alliance's fate. In the end, the wine's warmth wasn't just from the alcohol, but from the fragile hope that perhaps this time peace would outlast the buzz. A basket of pears, their curves glistening under a thick amber cloak of honey, would arrive at the table like prisoners in gilded chains, beautiful but unmistakably bound. This was no ordinary dessert, it was edible diplomacy at its most cunning. When medieval conquerors served fruits preserved in honey, they weren't just showcasing culinary skill, they were staging a miniature reenactment of conquest itself. The fruit, once tart and independent, now swam in sticky submission, its edges softened by heat and time. Every syrupy bite drove home the lesson: resistance was futile, but surrender. That could be sweet. The choice of fruit was never accidental. Apricots from rebellious Armenian provinces, figs plucked from Moorish orchards in Granada, even apples from the Celtic hinterlands, each carried the weight of its origins. Byzantine emperors were particularly adept at this symbolism. After annexing Crete, they served local quinces drowned in thyme honey at the victory banquet, the herb's medicinal properties whispering a promise submission would heal the wounds of war. Meanwhile, in Norman Sicily, Arab honey met French pears in a jar, a culinary metaphor for the blending of cultures that was anything but voluntary. But the true psychological power lay in the preparation. Unlike jams or compotes that obliterated the fruit's original form, honey preservation kept each piece intact, visibly recognizable, yet fundamentally transformed. Manuscripts from the court of Alfonso the Wise describe how the fruits would be pricked with needles before immersion, allowing the honey to penetrate deeper, a not-so-subtle parallel to the spies and informants penetrating conquered territories. The process could take months, mirroring the slow, deliberate pace of political assimilation, and when the jars were finally opened at state dinners, the fruits emerged glossy and pliant, their once distinct edges smoothed into compliance. The serving ritual amplified the message. At the 1343 peace talks between Scotland and England, Edward III presented Scottish envoys with barrels of honeyed blackberries, their native fruit, preserved with English honey. The berries were arranged in the shape of the English crown, each one spooned onto Scottish plates by the king's own hand. Chroniclers noted the envoys' grimaces as they chewed. The berries, picked slightly underripe, retained a whisper of their original sharpness beneath the cloying sweetness, a perfect allegory for occupied lands pretending at contentment. Yet honey's stickiness carried a double meaning. While it symbolized domination, it also represented the inescapable interconnectedness of conqueror and conquered. When the Ottomans served honeyed plums to Balkan nobility, the dish came with silver skewers tools that allowed the eater to lift the fruit without touching the honey. But the moment the plum was bitten, juices mingled with honey on the tongue, proving that even the most careful diplomacy couldn't prevent cultural entanglement. Perhaps most revealing were the occasions when this recipe backfired. After the Welsh Revolt of 1295, Edward I famously attempted to serve honeyed Welsh pears at a reconciliation feast, only for the local bards to compose verses comparing the dish to a smile full of teeth. The pears, they noted, would eventually ferment in their own sweetness, turning the honey to vinegar, a prescient metaphor for colonial resentment. Centuries later, when Napoleon served honeyed Corsican clementines to his Italian allies, the citrus acidity cut through the sweetness so sharply that guests winced, a culinary omen of the alliance's impending souring. This was soft power at its most potent, a dish that could celebrate unity while reinforcing hierarchy, that could taste like generosity while leaving the aftertaste of coercion. And long after the plates were cleared, the lesson lingered. In the medieval world, even kindness could be a weapon, and the most effective conquests happened not on battlefields, but on banquet tables where every bite was a contract signed in golden syrup. Blackened meat arrived at the table not with fanfare, but in solemn silence, its charred crust cracking open like the earth of a fresh grave. This was culinary mourning at its most visceral, where every scorched edge spoke of loss too deep for words. When kings ordered their kitchens to burn the roast beyond recognition, it wasn't poor cooking. It was performance art of collective grief. The dish's bitterness became a shared language. Nobles who normally disdained anything less than medium rare now chewed through the ash without complaint, their grimaces a public penance. At the funeral feast of England's Edward I, chroniclers noted how the meat's smoke hung thick as incense, blending with the scent of extinguished candles, a sensory metaphor for a reign cut short. The ritual extended beyond royalty. After the catastrophic Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, the Hungarian court served mutton blackened with vinegar-soaked oak chips, the acidity evoking tears. But the true genius lay in the dish's duality. While the exterior proclaimed devastation, the interior often remained shockingly tender. When Elena of Provence mourned her husband Henry III, she insisted the beef be seared black yet rosy at the center, a whispered promise that the dynasty's heart still beat beneath the scars. This technique, recorded in a surviving kitchen scroll from Westminster, required precise timing. The meat spent exactly 40 minutes in the hottest part of the oven, mirroring the 40 days of Lenten reflection. Presentation amplified the symbolism. Blackened dishes were typically carried into the hall on unadorned pewter, a stark contrast to the gilded platters of celebratory feasts. At the Burgundian court, mourners were given black-handled knives to carve the meat, their ebony grips staining fingers like ink, a tactile reminder that grief leaves marks. Some recipes took the metaphor further, stuffing the charred carcasses with unripe berries or bitter greens, ensuring no bite offered respite. After the fall of Constantinople, the exiled Byzantine emperor served crow blackened with tarragon, the bird's natural toughness forcing guests to labor for each morsel, an edible allegory for the struggle ahead. What made these recipes so potent was their universality as political theater. A ruler sharing blackened meat demonstrated humility, but when served to rivals, the message turned ominous. The infamous Feast of Ashes following the 100 Years' War saw the French king present English envoys with deliberately over-salted charred venison, a culinary gravestone for their continental ambitions. Meanwhile, in Scotland, clans used the dish to signal temporary truces. Consuming blackened game together meant acknowledging shared losses before returning to feuds. The most chilling variations appeared in times of plague. Venetian diarist Marin Sanudo described a 1485 banquet where every course, even the bread, bore intentional scorch marks, transforming the entire meal into a memento mori. Servants wore gloves dipped in lampblack, leaving fingerprints on wine goblets like shadows of the dying. This wasn't mere morbidity, it was a calculated display of resilience. By confronting decay at the table, rulers demonstrated they could stare into the abyss and still demand dessert be served. Long after the plates were cleared, the lesson lingered in the aftertaste. Unlike sweetened fruits or gilded bread, these recipes offered no false comfort. Their bitterness was the point, a reminder that even crowns couldn't cheat death, only chew through it slowly, in full view of the court, one ashen bite at a time. The crust of the dove pie cracked open with a sound like distant thunder, revealing tender birds nestled in a bed of rosemary and figs, a dish too delicate for war, too potent to ignore. More than mere sustenance, this was culinary theater at its most strategic. Doves, those universal symbols of peace, became edible ambassadors when baked into a golden shell, their wings folded not in flight but in surrender to the oven's heat. The ritual of serving them en croûte, encased in pastry like treasure in a reliquary, turned every slice into a sacrament of truce. When the Duke of Burgundy presented such a pie to the rebellious citizens of Ghent in 1452, the message was unambiguous: break bread, not treaties. Yet the true brilliance lay in the pie's duality. To accept a portion was to publicly endorse reconciliation. To refuse risked branding oneself a warmonger before the assembled court. Chronicles from the Wars of the Roses describe how Richard III's chefs would prepare twin dove pies, one with seasoned meat for allies, another left deliberately bland for those being tested. The latter group's reactions, whether they choked down the tasteless filling or pushed it away, determined their place in the new regime. Even the pastry itself held meaning. Cross-hatched tops evoked fishing nets, a nod to Christ's call to become fishers of men, while lattice crusts mirrored the interlaced rings of marriage alliances. The preparation process was a diplomatic dance. Doves had to be slaughtered just before baking, ensuring their flesh remained pure white, a visual metaphor for untainted intentions. Recipes from the Vatican archives reveal how papal chefs would tuck bay leaves under each bird's wing, their aromatic oils permeating the meat as it cooked, a subtle suggestion that peace-like flavor should seep into every fiber. Some courts took the symbolism further, baking tiny olive wood doves into the crust. Diners who found one in their slice were honor-bound to toast the host's health, a tradition that survives today in the Christmas pudding's hidden coin. But the pie's most chilling power emerged when negotiations faltered. At the 1488 summit between Hungary and the Ottomans, Sultan Bayezid II's chefs produced a pie containing 12 doves, one for each disputed fortress. As the crust was pierced, 6 birds flew free while 6 remained cooked, their fate determined by how tightly they'd been trussed before baking. The Sultan's explanation, some bonds chafe, others nourish, left little doubt which forts he expected returned. Similarly, when Elizabeth I served dove pie to Spanish envoys during Armada tensions, the birds arrived not whole but chopped, swimming in a sauce of crushed grapes, a none too subtle allusion to the bloodshed awaiting those who refused her terms. What makes this recipe so enduring is its psychological precision. Unlike the boar's head's brute intimidation or the sugar swan's sweet coercion, the dove pie exploited the human instinct for communal eating. Sharing food triggers primal trust, a fact medieval rulers weaponized. The Florentine statesman Machiavelli noted how rebels who ate the pie seldom took up arms again, their stomachs having literally digested the idea of peace. And when the last crumb vanished, the message lingered. In this Game of Thrones, even mercy came with teeth hidden in the dough. A slab of venison carved into a lion's snarling visage, its mane rendered in crisp shreds of leek, arrived with the solemnity of a crown being placed on a sovereign's head. This wasn't just dinner theater. It was an edible coronation, a dish that turned butcher's work into heraldry. In courts where actual lion meat was taboo, too sacred, too dangerous to hunt, chefs became sculptors, pressing spiced forcer meat into molds or arranging roasted joints to mimic the beast's muscular lines. The moment the lion was presented, often on a shield-shaped platter with crossed knives as scepters, every guest understood tonight's host wasn't merely feeding them. He was performing kingship through their jaws. The lion's anatomy held deliberate political coding. A raised paw signaled benevolence, while a bared fang hinted at readiness to strike, subtleties lost on no one at the table. When Charlemagne's chefs presented a boar-lion hybrid boar's body, lion's head to Saxon chieftains, the message was brutal. Your strength has been absorbed into our greater glory. Even the choice of base meat whispered volumes. Beef lions spoke of agrarian stability, while those fashioned from exotic venison like the stag lion served at Richard the Lionheart's post-crusade feast proclaimed mastery over untamed frontiers. Preparation rituals bordered on the sacramental. Manuscripts from the court of Aragon describe how the carving knife would first be dipped in wine, a nod to the legend that lions only drank running water, proving their purity. The Florentines took it further, stuffing their lion loaves with live songbirds that burst free when sliced, a flurry of wings and startled trills meant to evoke divine approval. But the most chilling variation came from Byzantium, where the liver believed to house courage was always served slightly pink, a dare to guests. Can you stomach what I've conquered? Timing the dish's arrival was its own power play. Served too early, it risked seeming desperate; too late, and the metaphor soured into gluttony. At the Field of the Cloth of Gold summit, Francis I of France outmaneuvered Henry VIII by presenting his lion mid-banquet, just as English heralds were boasting of their king's wrestling prowess. The French lion, molded from tender veal and gilded with egg wash, collapsed theatrically under the serving fork, prompting Francis to quip, "Even the king of beasts kneels to superior skill." What made this recipe so potent was its adaptability across cultures. Moorish sultans fashioned lions from lamb and apricots, their sweetness disarming opponents before negotiations. In Poland, a bison-lion hybrid celebrated the union of cavalry might and regal authority. And when the Habsburgs needed to humble a boastful Venetian envoy, they served a lion sculpted from minced pike, a fish that, when alive, strikes its prey with terrifying speed. The envoy's forced smile as he chewed the rubbery flesh became legend. He swallowed the lion, but the lion swallowed his pride first. This was culinary propaganda at its most sublime, a dish that demanded participation. To carve the lion was to acknowledge its maker's right to rule. To eat it was to metabolize that authority. And when the last shred of Leek mane was gone, the lesson remained. In a world where few could hunt lions, every ruler could still make his subjects taste what it meant to be one. 5 rare spices swirled into the rich blood of freshly hunted venison, not just a meal, but an edible empire stitched together with flavor. The 5-spice venison of unity emerged at banquets like a living map, its aromatic steam rising to outline borders without ink or parchment. Each spice in the rub represented a conquered territory or grudging ally. Cinnamon for the southern plains, its sweetness masking the bitterness of their surrender. Cloves from eastern islands, their numbing properties a metaphor for pacified unrest. Star anise with its 8 perfect points, one for each noble house brought to heel. Even the meat itself whispered of domination. Venison taken from royal forests where only the crown could hunt. Its lean texture proof that the ruler's hand could tenderize even the toughest opposition. The preparation ritual turned kitchens into council chambers. A scribe would record as the master cook measured each spice in precise ratios that mirrored current political realities. More pepper than cumin this year, a clear nod to the merchant cities gaining favor over rural lords. Manuscripts from the court of Ferdinand and Isabella reveal how saffron threads were added last, one for every rebellious province now quieted, their golden hue symbolizing the wealth submission could bring. The venison would then be massaged for exactly 100 strokes, a number corresponding to the Psalms, transforming butchery into divine ordinance. Serving this dish required choreography worthy of a coronation. The roast arrived encircled by 5 sauces, each made from one spice in isolation, a stark reminder of how weak these flavors stood alone. The host would then mix them tableside into one harmonious blend, his stirring spoon scraping the platter with the finality of a pen signing a treaty. At the 1486 Diet of Nuremberg, Maximilian I took the metaphor further, having representatives from each territory pour their assigned sauce while reciting vows of fealty. The resulting aroma, pungent, complex, unmistakably unified, hung over the hall like an oath no one dared break. But the true test came in the eating. Court physicians monitored guests for reactions. Those who reached for water after biting into the heavily peppered sections were noted as having weak constitutions, read unreliable loyalties. The Florentines added a diabolical twist, serving the venison barely seared at the center, so only those who truly embraced the dish's vision would stomach the rawness at its heart. And when the Holy Roman Empire needed to humble a boastful Polish envoy, they served his portion on a bed of crushed juniper berries, a spice not in the original 5, its piney bitterness a warning against seeking a 6th seat at the table. This was nation-building served medium rare, where every chew reinforced hierarchy. The spices that initially clashed on the tongue eventually melded into something greater, just as the ruler's vision absorbed all dissent. And when the platter was cleared, the lesson remained. In the alchemy of power, even the most stubborn flavors could be remixed into unity, so long as the hand stirring the pot wore a crown. Amid the decadence of medieval feasting, where golden bread and spiced venison proclaimed power through excess, the simplest dish of all became the most subversive, a humble cup of almond milk served not with fanfare but with quiet deliberation. This was the ultimate flex of restraint, a ruler's way of declaring, "I could drown you in riches, but I choose purity instead." When Byzantine emperors observed Lent by replacing their usual wine with almond milk, the gesture wasn't just religious, it was a masterclass in psychological dominance. The drink's creamy whiteness, untouched by animal products, became a blank canvas onto which courts projected their awe. If a monarch could willingly strip back to such austerity, what couldn't they resist? The preparation ritual elevated simplicity to spectacle. Almonds had to be blanched in view of the court, their brown skins slipping away like discarded vices, then ground by hand, never machine, to prove the ruler's connection to pious labor. Manuscripts from the Abbey of Cluny reveal how the milk would be strained through linen woven by nuns, each fold of fabric a metaphor for filtering out corruption. But the true power lay in the serving vessel, a plain clay cup when humility was the message, or paradoxically, a jewel-encrusted goblet when the lesson was about restraint despite temptation. At the Council of Constance in 1417, the papal legate served almond milk in a cup carved from a single emerald, its dazzling green walls holding the white liquid like virtue cradled within wealth. This recipe's genius was its duality. To visiting ambassadors accustomed to rich meats, the almond milk fast tasted like surrender until they noticed the subtle additions. A whisper of rosewater hinted at access to Persian trade routes. A dusting of imported cinnamon proved the host's spice coffers were full, just voluntarily untapped. When the Duke of Burgundy wanted to humble a boastful Italian merchant, he served him almond milk laced with ambergris, a luxury so rare it cost more than gold, proving even his modest drinks outstripped others' extravagance. Conversely, Elena of Castile once served unflavored almond milk in battered tin cups to rebellious nobles, forcing them to drink under the gaze of starving peasants, a visceral reminder that their gluttony fed discontent. The almond milk fast reached its zenith as political theater during times of crisis. After losing Jerusalem, King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, himself suffering from leprosy, hosted a banquet where almond milk was the only offering. His explanation, recorded by horrified Crusader chroniclers, "If I cannot savor victory, why should you savor anything?" The gesture crushed a budding rebellion overnight as nobles grasped the deeper truth. A ruler who embraced austerity when weakened would be terrifying when restored. Even in victory, the recipe held power. Following his conquest of Granada, Ferdinand of Aragon celebrated not with wine, but almond milk blended with snow from the Sierra Nevada, a drink that required hundreds of runners to transport ice before it melted. The message, his reach could summon winter itself to his table, yet he chose purity over plunder. What makes this recipe so enduring is its quiet revolution. While golden bread dazzled and boars' heads intimidated, almond milk did something far more dangerous. It made virtue irresistible. Court poets wrote odes to its whiteness, comparing it to divine light. Physicians prescribed it as a cure for moral decay. And when the last drop was drained, the aftertaste lingered like a whispered challenge. True power isn't about what you consume, but what you willingly set aside. In a world drunk on excess, the monarch who served almond milk didn't just control a kingdom, they controlled themselves, and that was the most terrifying strength of all. The crown roast of hegemony arrived at the table like a fortress of ribs, each bone polished to gleam like the jewels they imitated, their curved formation an unmistakable echo of royal headgear. This was no ordinary cut of meat, it was architecture, an edible coronation circle where every bite required guests to bow metaphorically as they leaned in to eat. The dish's genius lay in its brutal simplicity. To partake was to literally consume the symbol of authority, teeth-scraping bone in a visceral act of submission. When King Matthias of Hungary served his crown roast at the Diet of Pressburg, the ribs were interlaced with strips of bacon woven like ermine trim, a detail that turned gluttony into heraldry. But the true intimidation came from the roast's construction. Unlike other dishes that disguised their labor, the crown flaunted its butchery. The ribs had to be Frenched, a process where each bone was scraped clean of flesh halfway down, exposing white shafts that resembled the ivory tusks of conquered beasts. Recipes from the Burgundian court specify that exactly 12 ribs formed the crown, mirroring the apostles at the Last Supper, with the centermost rib reserved for the ruler alone. Some versions took the metaphor further, stuffing the center with a single roasted songbird, its tiny body dwarfed by the meaty battlements, a stark reminder of how small even nobility seemed beneath the crown's shadow. Serving this dish required choreographed intimidation. The roast would enter the hall on a litter carried by 4 pages, their arms trembling under its weight, a theatrical display of the burden of rule. At the court of Louis XI, the carver would first plunge a dagger into the center cavity, releasing a cascade of spiced wine that pooled like blood around the platter's base. Guests were then served in strict order of rank, with the juiciest outer ribs going to allies and the tougher, overcooked inner portions reserved for those in disfavor. One Florentine ambassador's diary describes receiving a rib slick with molten fat, a deliberate test of his ability to stomach the king's policies without flinching. What made this recipe so potent was its adaptability across cultures. The Ottomans fashioned their crown roasts from lamb ribs glazed with pomegranate molasses, the tart fruit symbolizing both fertility and the blood of enemies. In Poland, the ribs were smoked over juniper branches, their piney aroma evoking the forests that formed the kingdom's natural defenses. But perhaps the most chilling variation came from Tudor England, where Henry VIII's chefs would sometimes present the crown roast upside down, a culinary nod to the fate awaiting those who challenged divine right. This was power served on the bone, where every gnawed rib became a signed loyalty oath. And when the platter was finally empty, the bare bones remained, white and gleaming like the skeleton of a kingdom, its architecture laid bare for all to see. The Porpoise of Prosperity arrived not on a platter, but in a silver basin of seawater, its sleek gray body floating amidst seaweed and crushed ice, a creature of the open ocean now stranded in a hall of terrestrial power. This wasn't just exotic cuisine, it was a maritime empire served cold. When medieval kings presented porpoise at state banquets, the dish's rarity spoke louder than any herald's trumpet. Each slice of blubber-rich meat was an edible map, charting the host's dominance over coastlines and trade winds. The Venetian diarist Marino Sanuto once wrote of a 14th century feast where the porpoise's arrival upstaged the ambassador it was meant to impress, its very presence proving the host ships could pluck treasures from waters others couldn't even navigate. What made this recipe so potent was its impossibility inland. Unlike venison or beef that could be sourced locally, porpoise required a relay of fast horsemen and saltwater tanks to transport it alive. Accounts from the court of Henry V describe how the royal fishmonger maintained a network of coastal holding ponds, where captured porpoises were kept until the moment a state dinner demanded their sacrifice. The meat spoiled within hours of death, so timing was everything, a logistical ballet that demonstrated the crown's control over time itself. When the Duke of Burgundy served porpoise to the English envoy in 1503, the envoy's scribe noted the kitchen staff swollen, brine-chapped hands evidence of the midnight ride from Calais that brought the creature fresh to the table. The preparation ritual turned butchery into theater. Porpoise flesh was always carved vertically in thin slices that resembled rolled charts, a nod to the maritime charts that made its capture possible. Byzantine chefs took the symbolism further, arranging the slices in concentric circles to mimic compass roses, with a central mound of caviar as the true north guiding the kingdom's ambitions. But the true power lay in the accompaniments, sauces made from spices that could only reach Europe via the very sea routes the porpoise symbolized. A surviving recipe from Genoa pairs the meat with a sauce of crushed peppercorns and ambergris, the latter harvested from whale intestines, making the dish a two-tiered flex of naval supremacy. Serving porpoise was psychological warfare disguised as hospitality. When the Hanseatic League sought to intimidate Scottish wool merchants, they served porpoise seared black on one side, the charred half facing the Scots, the pink flesh turned toward Hanseatic delegates. The unspoken message: we control the fire that could scald your trade. Conversely, Alfonso the Magnanimous of Aragon once served it raw to Moorish emissaries, thinly sliced like Carpaccio with lemon from his Sicilian groves, a reminder that his fleets could deliver perishable luxuries faster than Allah's winds could fill rebel sails. The dish's ultimate power lay in its impermanence. Unlike smoked meats or pickled fish that could be stockpiled, porpoise was a fleeting spectacle here for one night, gone by morning, just like the alliances it cemented. When the last morsel disappeared, the lesson lingered. In the medieval world, true prosperity wasn't measured in gold, but in the ability to summon the sea itself to your table, then consume it before your rivals even smelled salt on the breeze. Steam rose from the cauldrons in thick, onion-scented clouds, each bubble bursting to release the earthy perfume of leeks simmered to tenderness, a far cry from the usual battlefield stench of sweat and steel. This was no ordinary campfire meal. The leek soup of solidarity transformed a common vegetable into the ultimate rallying cry, served in wooden bowls rough-hewn from the same forests that would soon bear witness to war. When Welsh archers knelt to receive their portions on the eve of Agincourt, they weren't just eating, they were ingesting a centuries-old symbol of perseverance. The leek's white roots, still caked with soil, whispered of homeland, while its green shoots pointed defiantly toward tomorrow's fray. The ritual of sharing this soup turned sustenance into sacrament. Commanders would ladle it themselves, their sleeves rolled high to show forearms scarred by past campaigns, proof they'd earned the right to serve. Chronicles from the Burgundian Wars describe how Duke Charles the Bold insisted on stirring the cauldron with his own sword, the blade's edge dissolving traces of iron into the broth like a blood oath in liquid form. But the true alchemy happened when soldiers passed a single bowl hand to hand, each man taking precisely 3 sips, one for faith, one for king, and one for the brother whose shoulder would brace their bow the next morning. What made this dish so potent was its duality: simplicity on the surface, complexity beneath. The leeks were always sliced thin as sword strokes, their layers mirroring the ranks of an army. Some recipes added barley to thicken the broth, each swollen grain a metaphor for resilience under pressure. A surviving field kitchen manual from the 100 Years' War specifies that the soup must never be seasoned with salt, not to spare the supply, but because tears would provide enough sodium before dawn. The leek's symbolism cut deeper than its flavor. When Henry V's forces faced starvation at Harfleur, they foraged wild leeks from bombarded fields, their roots clinging to ravaged earth like hope to desperate men. Later, at the Siege of Orleans, Joan of Arc's troops added garlic to their soup, transforming it into the legendary soupe de l'Union, its pungency clearing sinuses and minds alike before the final assault. Even the Mongols adopted the tradition during their European campaigns, substituting leeks with wild onions but keeping the communal serving ritual, proving that even the fiercest warriors understood the glue of a shared meal. Perhaps the most chilling variation emerged during the Scottish Wars of Independence, when Robert the Bruce's cooks prepared the soup with leeks grown atop mass graves from earlier battles. The vegetables nourished by fallen comrades lent the broth an almost mythic gravity. Warriors spoke of seeing phantom faces in the steam, a psychological edge no enemy could counter. By the time the last dregs were drunk, the message was seared into every soul. Just as these leeks thrived in bloodied soil, so too would their cause. This was morale served piping hot, a dish that tasted of home when home was a memory, of victory when victory was still a prayer, and when the empty bowls were stacked at dawn, they didn't clatter. They rang like shields locking into formation. The gilded egg of renewal gleamed on its silver stand like a miniature sun, its shell burnished to a mirror finish that reflected the faces of those privileged enough to witness its unveiling. This was no ordinary egg, it was the culinary equivalent of a phoenix rising, a golden promise plated in edible ambition. At the coronation feast of Richard III, chroniclers recorded how the egg's arrival silenced the hall, its radiance outshining even the crown jewels. The symbolism was unmistakable. Just as life began within that fragile shell, so too would a new era hatch from the ruler's will. What made this dish so potent was its deceptive simplicity. Beneath the gold leaf lay the humblest of foods, an egg, accessible to peasant and prince alike. Yet the alchemy of gilding transformed it into a luxury beyond reach, much like the divine right it represented. Byzantine emperors took the metaphor further, serving eggs encased in latticework pastry that resembled cathedral windows. Breaking the crust became an act of consecration. The Florentines, ever the masters of psychological theater, would sometimes place a live songbird inside the hollowed egg before gilding it. When tapped with a spoon, the creature would burst free in a flurry of wings and gold dust, a living allegory for ideas breaking free from old constraints. The preparation ritual bordered on the sacred. Eggs had to be laid on the morning of the event, their shells still warm to the touch, a detail that turned breakfast into prophecy. Manuscripts from Westminster Abbey reveal how the gold leaf was applied with brushes made from the hair of virgins, a nod to purity of intention, but the true power lay in the serving. At the victory banquet following the Reconquista, Ferdinand and Isabella presented gilded eggs on pillows of saffron rice, each diner receiving one with instructions to crack it simultaneously. The resulting chorus of shells splitting echoed through the Alhambra like the sound of old moorings breaking. This recipe's brilliance was its adaptability. In times of peace, the eggs were served soft-boiled, their molten yolks spilling like liquid sunlight, a metaphor for prosperity flowing freely. During crises, they arrived hard-boiled and chilled, their firm centers a silent vow of resilience. After the Black Death ravaged Europe, Charles IV of Bohemia hosted a feast where 1,000 gilded eggs were suspended from the rafters on silk threads. Guests had to rise on tiptoe to claim one, a physical act of reaching toward renewal. Perhaps most poignant were the eggs served at royal births. Unlike the typical gold leaf version, these were dyed with turmeric and wrapped in vine leaves before gilding, the organic materials decaying over days to reveal the vibrant yellow beneath, a tactile lesson that true renewal required both time and the shedding of artifice. When the last fleck of gold was scraped from the plate, the message remained: in a world of fragile power, sometimes the most enduring revolutions begin with something as simple as an egg and the courage to gild it. A coarse, dark loaf of barley bread thudded onto the banquet table with none of the fanfare reserved for golden delicacies, its cracked crust and uneven shape a stark confession of hard times. This was no accident of the kitchen, but a carefully staged performance of solidarity. When kings swapped their usual wheat for barley, the message cut deeper than any proclamation: I eat what you eat. During the Great Famine of 1315, Edward II of England shocked his court by serving barley loaves at Christmas, their gritty texture and bitter aftertaste mirroring the misery beyond palace walls. Chroniclers noted how nobles gagged on the bread's roughness, a discomfort the king endured without flinching, his jaw working methodically through each mouthful like a penance. The genius of this recipe lay in its imperfections. Unlike the uniform golden loaves that symbolized divine perfection, barley bread was deliberately misshapen, often underbaked at the center, proof it had been rushed to the table in shared urgency. Manuscripts from the court of Philip the Fair reveal how bakers would sometimes mix in small stones or chaff, creating the illusion that royal ovens used the same contaminated grain as peasant mills. The bread wasn't just eaten, it was performed. Louis IX of France took theatrical bites before his starving subjects during the Seventh Crusade, letting crumbs fall conspicuously onto his tunic like a man too burdened to care for appearances. But this culinary theater had razor-sharp edges. When served to visiting dignitaries, barley bread became a weapon of guilt. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV once presented a single loaf to Bohemian nobles complaining of taxes, its density so extreme it broke a serving knife. "If my people survive on this," he remarked while sawing through the crust, "can your coffers not survive lighter burdens?" The bread's very existence forced the elite to confront their own excess, making refusal an act of callousness. Some rulers took the metaphor further. Alfonso X of Castile ordered his barley loaves stamped with the royal seal before baking, so the impression would distort in the oven, a visual metaphor for how crisis reshapes even crowns. The dish's psychological impact peaked during plagues. Venetian doges distributed barley bread wrapped in plain linen to quarantined districts, the absence of ceremonial ribbons signaling this wasn't charity but kinship. In London's Black Death outbreak, Edward III went further. His bakers intentionally burned the loaves slightly, then served them on pewter plates etched with mortality statistics. Every scorched bite forced the nobility to taste the desperation their policies had allegedly eased. What made barley bread so devastatingly effective was its temporary nature. After crises passed, kings would host return-to-wheat ceremonies where the first golden loaf was ceremonially broken with a silver knife, a reminder that normalcy flowed from royal benevolence. The contrast cemented loyalty. Subjects who choked down barley for months now wept at the privilege of eating fine bread again, their gratitude tinged with relief that the crown's hardship had been optional all along. This wasn't just food, it was the original bread and circuses where every gritty crumb whispered the same lesson. Suffering tastes different when seasoned with the illusion of solidarity. A monstrous pike, its jaws pried open to reveal a belly stuffed with smaller fish, their tiny silver bodies packed tight like coins in a war chest, arrived at the table with a predator's silent grace. This wasn't just a dish, it was an aquatic allegory served cold. The stuffed pike of strategy turned dinner into a Darwinian parable, where every guest confronted the unspoken truth. In this hall, as in nature, the strong consumed the weak without remorse. When Ivan the Terrible served this to Novgorod's delegation during annexation talks, the message was as clear as the Volga's icy waters. Their city would be the next fish in Moscow's maw. The pike's anatomy made it the perfect edible threat. Unlike docile carp or sluggish eels, pike were born hunters, their needle teeth designed to grip struggling prey. Medieval bestiaries even claimed they could smell fear in the water. Chefs amplified this terror by selecting species for stuffing that mirrored the ruler's recent conquests: herring for Hanseatic towns, perch for rebellious river lords, even miniature pike for rival branches of the royal family. A Venetian spy's report from the Hungarian court describes a 4-foot pike stuffed with 7 varieties of fish, each representing a territory King Matthias planned to digest that year. Preparation rituals leaned into the brutality. The pike was never gutted through the belly like common fish, but through the gills, keeping its predatory visage intact. Some recipes called for stuffing the smaller fish alive, their final twitches visible as the pike entered the oven. At the Burgundian court, chefs took theatricality further, arranging the stuffed fish in attack poses atop edible reeds as if frozen mid-hunt. But the true psychological warfare came during carving. The host would slide the knife along the pike's lateral line, revealing the smaller fish perfectly preserved inside a grotesque Russian doll of domination. Diplomats learned to read the subtleties. A pike served with its stuffing fish facing outward signaled merciful assimilation, while those packed headfirst hinted at obliteration. When the Teutonic knights received a pike with the tails of its contents protruding like banners, they understood: surrender with dignity or be swallowed whole. The Holy Roman Empire added a chilling twist, serving the dish with the pike's stomach left partially uncooked, so the stuffing fish remained recognizable. See how even in death they retain their identity. Frederick III reportedly murmured to a Bohemian envoy, "A privilege your towns will keep." If they yield, what made this recipe so devastating was its universality across cultures. The Ottomans prepared it as Sultan's delight, adding raisins to the stuffing as a taunt sweetness amid submission. Polish kings served pike stuffed with Prussian carp alongside glasses of seawater, a nod to their Baltic ambitions. But the most brutal variation came from Muscovy, where Ivan III's chefs would sometimes replace the stuffing fish with carved vegetables resembling human figures, a not-so-veiled reference to Novgorod's impending harvest. This was realpolitik served on a silver tide, where every flake of flesh carried the aftertaste of empire, and when the last bone was picked clean, the lesson lingered like the scent of river mud. In the Game of Thrones, you were either the devourer or the devoured. Rose petals floated atop the creamy pudding like scattered promises, their delicate fragrance perfuming the air with the heady scent of diplomacy. This was no ordinary dessert. It was the rose pudding of romance, a dish where every spoonful carried the weight of dynasties. At medieval betrothal feasts, the presentation alone was theater. Servers would pour rosewater syrup over the pudding at the table, the liquid tracing slow, deliberate paths like the ink of a marriage contract unfurling. The deeper the syrup soaked, the more binding the alliance, a fact not lost on ambassadors who watched anxiously as the pink stain spread. But the true genius of this recipe lay in its duality. The roses themselves were always candied first, their natural bitterness preserved beneath a brittle sugar shell, a perfect metaphor for royal marriages that balanced sweetness with steel. Manuscripts from the court of Aragon reveal how chefs would sometimes layer the pudding with alternating white and red rose layers, symbolizing the blending of bloodlines. One notorious version served at the marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon concealed whole peppercorns beneath the rose garnish, a spicy warning that this union would have bite. The ritual of serving amplified the tension. The pudding arrived under a domed pastry lid pierced with tiny holes when lifted. The escaping rose scent would engulf the hall, a sensory bombardment designed to lower defenses. Noble daughters were taught to take precisely 3 bites, one for obedience, one for fertility, and one for political discretion. At the infamous pudding protest of 1469, a Burgundian countess refused the third bite, instead smearing the dessert across her betrothed's ducal seal, a scandal that dissolved the alliance and inspired a papal edict on dessert etiquette. What made this dish so potent was its adaptability as both carrot and stick. When Mary Queen of Scots was served a rose pudding studded with edible pearls at her French betrothal, the pearls spelled out her mother-in-law's motto in cursive, a not-so-subtle reminder of who held the reins. Conversely, Henry VIII's kitchens once served a deliberately lumpy version to a reluctant Anne of Cleves, the uneven texture mirroring his dissatisfaction. Even the type of rose held meaning: damask for virgins, gallica for widows, and the dreaded black roses of Provence for alliances forged under duress. The aftertaste lingered long after the plates were cleared. Court poets wrote of rose puddings that bloomed twice, once on the tongue, once in the womb. Physicians prescribed it to brides as a fertility aid, while spies noted who scraped their bowl clean enthusiasm versus who pushed petals aside resistance. In the end, this deceptively delicate dessert proved a ruthless truth. In the medieval world, even love was a dish best served with conditions. The hare hit the table still steaming, its lean muscles suspended in a broth darker than a midnight gallows, a meal that carried the metallic tang of urgency. This wasn't just stew, it was a stopwatch in a tureen. Medieval rulers understood the power of symbolism, and nothing declared swift justice like serving the fastest creature alive, reduced to tender submission. When Henry VIII's knights dragged a rebellious baron to dinner only to find hare stew as the first course, the message was clear: rebellion would be caught, gutted, and simmered before the candles burned low. What made this dish so chilling was its preparation speed. Unlike venison or boar that required days of marination, hare could go from field to cauldron in under an hour, a culinary parallel to summary execution. Manuscripts from the French royal kitchens reveal how chefs would leave the hare's feet protruding from the stew, their distinctive speed untouched by the cooking process. Let them see what becomes of fleet feet, Louis XI reportedly quipped while serving it to a fugitive-turned guest. The stew's broth was deliberately thin, lacking the usual flour thickeners, so every spoonful echoed the haste it represented. The serving ritual amplified the threat. Stew bowls arrived with the hare's skull left intact at the bottom. Diners would discover it only after draining their portion, like finding a warrant folded under their napkin. At the court of Castile, Isabella's chefs took it further, garnishing each bowl with a single arrow-shaped carrot, a nod to how quickly royal hunters could pin dissent. But the true psychological mastery came from temperature control. The stew was served scalding hot, forcing impatient guests to either burn their tongues or wait, a microcosm of the crown's lesson. Act rashly and you'll get burned. Wait too long and your chance evaporates. Diplomats learned to read the variations. A stew with whole juniper berries signaled preemptive strikes, the berries' prickly texture mimicking the surprise of dawn raids, while those heavy on vinegar hinted at punitive campaigns meant to sour a region's morale. After the Pilgrimage of Grace uprising, Henry VIII's kitchens prepared a version with hare hearts left whole but pierced with cloves, each clove representing an executed rebel leader. The surviving nobles chewed in silence, the spice's numbing effect a bitter metaphor for suppressed dissent. This was judicial theater at its most potent, where every stringy tendon between the teeth whispered a warning. And when the last drop of broth was mopped up with bread, the lesson remained. In the Game of Thrones, you might outrun the hounds, but you'd never outpace the crown's appetite for retribution. The fig tart arrived at the table unassuming, its lattice crust golden and crisp, the purple flesh of the fruit peeking through like whispered confessions. But in the flickering candlelight of medieval council chambers, this was no simple dessert. every slice concealed layers of meaning as dense as the figs themselves, fruits long associated with hidden knowledge since Adam and Eve cloaked themselves with fig leaves. When a ruler slid this tart toward a visiting diplomat, they weren't just offering sweetness, they were extending an edible contract. To accept a peace was to swear silence without uttering a word, the sticky seeds clinging to teeth like the burden of secrets. The tart's design was psychological warfare disguised as pastry. The lattice crust wasn't just decorative, it mirrored the crossed arms of conspirators swearing oaths. Manuscripts from the Venetian secret archives reveal how chefs would leave one deliberate gap in the latticework, a visual metaphor for the single loophole in the implied agreement. The filling held even darker subtleties. Some recipes called for mixing figs from two different regions, Spanish figs for their honeyed richness, Turkish figs for their peppery bite, symbolizing that the secrets shared might contain both promises and threats. At the infamous Council of Constance, a tart served to rival cardinals oozed fig syrup onto the tablecloth in dark, branching patterns, staining the linen like the spreading roots of gossip. Breaking the tart required ceremony. The host would always take the first slice, plunging the knife through the center with exaggerated care, a performance meant to demonstrate how delicately secrets must be handled. Guests were then expected to hold their portion on their tongue for 3 seconds before chewing, a sensory reminder that some truth should dissolve slowly. The Florentines took the ritual further, serving individual miniature tarts with crusts sealed by the diner's own signet ring pressed into the dough. To break the seal was to break one's word, the pastry's integrity serving as collateral, but the true genius of this recipe was its plausible deniability. Unlike sworn oaths that left paper trails, the fig tart left only crumbs. When the Duke of Milan was accused of plotting against the Pope, he simply gestured to the untouched tart at the center of his table, its intact crust serving as his alibi. Conversely, Isabella of Castile once ended negotiations with a half-eaten tart deliberately left to attract flies, the rotting fruit a visceral warning about what happens to loose tongues. Even the tart's aftertaste played a role. The lingering fig seeds became a sensory trigger, ensuring every time a conspirator tasted them thereafter, they'd recall their silent vow. This was intrigue baked to perfection, where every bite bound tighter than any signed parchment, and when the last crumb vanished, the lesson remained. In the medieval world, the sweetest fruits often bore the sharpest thorns of consequence. A single grain of saffron could ransom a peasant's entire harvest, yet medieval kings tossed handfuls into their rice as casually as children scattering petals. When that golden mound shimmered onto the banquet table, it wasn't just food. It was a pyre burning with the profits of empires. The saffron rice of opulence turned every grain into a tiny mirror, reflecting the ruler's ability to set fire to wealth for sheer spectacle. In a world where spices were currency, this dish was a mint, its aroma alone worth more than the annual taxes of a small province. The true power lay in saffron's impossible economics. To color a single pot of rice required thousands of hand-picked crocus stigmas, each delicate thread plucked at dawn by veiled women in Spanish monasteries or Persian hillsides. Manuscripts from the treasury of Mame the Conqueror reveal that his kitchens burned through more saffron in a month than Venice's entire annual trade, a flex so blatant it sparked rumors he discovered King Maida's tomb. But the real alchemy happened in the serving ritual. The rice was always mounded into a perfect dome, its peak dusted with extra saffron like a gilded crown. At the court of Aragon, servants would pour hot broth tableside, sending liquid gold cascading down the sides in a calculated reenactment of mineral wealth flowing from mines. Diplomats learned to read the golden gradients. A uniformly yellow dish signaled stable prosperity, while rice with concentrated saffron streaks at the center hinted at reserves hidden from public ledgers. When Timur the Lame entertained ambassadors from rival khanates, his chefs prepared 3 versions, one with saffron only on the surface bluffing abundance, another with the spice mixed throughout genuine wealth, and a third where the golden hue came from cheaper turmeric beneath a saffron veneer, a test of observational skills. Those who called out the deception were rewarded. Those who pretended not to notice found their next trade proposals misfiled. This recipe's psychological brilliance was its built-in scarcity theater. Unlike gold plates that could be reused, saffron's color faded with each reheating, forcing hosts to prepare fresh batches for every meal, waste be damned. The Doge of Venice famously served saffron rice daily during a financial crisis, the escalating intensity of its hue convincing creditors his coffers were bottomless. Meanwhile, Burgundian dukes would let their rice sit until cold, the dulling orange serving as a veiled threat. My wealth decays, yet still I feast. Perhaps the most devastating variation came from Mughal India, where emperors paired the rice with silver-leafed naan not for taste, but so guests would exhale flecks of precious metal onto the golden grains with every bite. The resulting shimmer in their breath became known as the sigh of the taxed, proof that even the air around this dish carried the weight of extracted tribute. Long after the last grain was eaten, the lesson lingered like saffron's earthy perfume. True power wasn't just about having wealth, but about flaunting its deliberate destruction. In the medieval world, where most starved and kings gilded their porridge, that golden rice wasn't sustenance, it was sovereignty served steaming, one ruinously expensive spoonful at a time. The acorn bread arrived at the table unpretentious, its crust cracked like drought-stricken earth, its dense crumb the color of storm clouds. This was no artisanal loaf, but a testament to teeth-gritting survival, baked from flour ground from what squirrels hoarded and kings disdained. When famine stalked the land, rulers who served this bread performed a delicate alchemy, transforming hunger into solidarity with every coarse bite. The message was clear: if the crown could stomach acorns, so too could the kingdom. What made this recipe extraordinary was its brutal honesty. Unlike barley bread's staged austerity, acorn flour couldn't be faked. The leaching process alone, soaking the nuts to remove bitter tannins, took days of labor, leaving hands stained brown like peasant farmers. Chronicles from the Great Famine of 1315 describe how Edward II's bakers mixed the flour with ash from castle hearths, the alkaline powder neutralizing acidity while symbolically uniting high and low. Each loaf bore the scorch marks of communal ovens where nobles and serfs baked side by side, their shared struggle kneaded into the dough. The serving ritual turned sustenance into sacrament. Kings would break the bread with their bare hands rather than ceremonial knives, a deliberate vulnerability that disarmed dissent. At the court of starving winters in Norway, Håkon V paired the bread with bowls of melted snow, proclaiming, "What the land withholds, ingenuity provides." But the true psychological power lay in the aftertaste. Acorn bread's faint bitterness lingered like memory, a tactile reminder that survival came at a cost. When French rebels sampled Philip VI's pain de cherne during crop failures, they found it sweetened with the last honey from royal hives, a stingless lesson that even in deprivation, the crown still held sweetness to share. Yet this dish's brilliance was its dual-edged symbolism. In prosperous years, rulers displayed uneaten acorn loaves as relics at harvest festivals, tarnished trophies of battles against scarcity. The Florentine archives reveal how the Medici kept a petrified loaf under glass, its crumbling edges proof they'd steered the city through lean times. Conversely, rebellious lords learned to weaponize the bread. During the Peasants' Revolt, Wat Tyler's followers dumped sacks of acorn flour before Richard II's palace, their unspoken threat echoing, "You taught us to survive on nothing. Now watch what nothing men can do." This was food as living history, each gritty mouthful connecting present hardship to ancestral perseverance. And when the last crumb vanished, the lesson remained. True resilience wasn't measured in golden feasts, but in the quiet courage to need hope from the forest floor. The quince sat on the cutting board, hard as unripe ambition, its yellow skin dull compared to the golden transformation awaiting it. This unassuming fruit, so bitter raw it could pucker a noble's lips for hours, became the centerpiece of one of history's most cunning culinary lessons, the quince paste of patience. Unlike other royal dishes that dazzled with immediate opulence, this one demanded time, its slow alchemy from astringent to ambrosial serving as an edible parable. When Alfonso the Wise of Castile presented quince paste to his restless courtiers, he didn't just serve dessert, he staged a 3-day spectacle of boiling, straining, and reducing, turning the palace kitchens into a theater where the fruit's grudging sweetness became proof of divine right's transformative power. The process was a masterclass in psychological conditioning. Quinces couldn't be rushed, their stubborn flesh required hours of simmering just to soften, their tannins breaking down at a pace that mocked human urgency. Medieval chefs amplified the drama by performing each step in view of the court. The fruit's initial hardness tested with ceremonial daggers, the boiling cauldrons stirred with wooden spoons carved from olive trees, symbols of peace through perseverance. At the court of Navarre, scribes recorded how the paste's color shift from pale yellow to deep ruby was marked by hourly bell tolls, each chime a reminder that even time itself bowed to the crown's schedule. Serving the paste required ritualistic precision. Cut into squares and stamped with the royal seal while still warm, each piece was presented on a slate tablet etched with the number of days its preparation required, an edible receipt of imperial patience. Byzantine emperors took the metaphor further, layering the paste with sheets of beeswax that had to be peeled away like the passage of seasons. "The fruit resists, the fire persists," recited the server as the wax curled away, revealing the glossy candy beneath. Guests were then given silver needles to extract the quince seeds, tiny trophies of endurance, which they'd pocket as reminders that even the bitterest subjects could be sweetened under steadfast rule. But the true brilliance lay in the dish's dual audience. For nobles, the paste's luxurious spices, cinnamon from Ceylon, cardamom from the Malabar coast, hinted that patience brought exotic rewards. For visiting rebels, chefs left a portion unspiced, its lingering astringency a warning that without royal guidance, their lands would remain unripe. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II weaponized this nuance, serving quince paste alongside raw slices to Lombard delegates. Their grimaces as they compared the two became the talk of the Diet of Cremona. Perhaps the most devastating variation came from the Ottomans, who fermented their quince paste with honey until it bubbled like a swamp. Servants would bring the foaming vat to the table, ladling it onto plates where it solidified within minutes, a visceral demonstration of how quickly chaos could be shaped into order under the Sultan's hand. And when the last sticky bite was eaten, the lesson clung to the teeth like the paste itself. In a world of impulsive rebellions and fleeting alliances, true power belonged to those who could stomach the slow simmer of time. Flames of spun sugar licked at the phoenix cake's gilded wings, their delicate curves rising from a base of charred almond cake, a masterpiece of destruction and renewal frozen in edible amber. This wasn't mere confectionery, it was culinary necromancy, a sugar-spun resurrection served with the solemnity of a coronation. When the Black Death emptied England's treasury, Edward III presented this cake at the first post-plague Parliament, its ashes-dusted surface hiding layers of saffron cake beneath, each slice revealing brighter yellows until the final bite gleamed like dawn. The message was visceral. Even when the crown appeared reduced to embers, its core remained untouched, waiting to rise. The cake's preparation was a ritual of controlled ruin. Bakers would torch the outer almond layers with brandy-soaked rags, the flames timed to leave the interior moist and vibrant, a metaphor for kingdoms that burned but never collapsed. Manuscripts from the Burgundian court describe how the phoenix's tail feathers were crafted from caramel shards, designed to shatter when struck with a silver spoon. The sound, echoing through silent halls, became known as the breaking of mourning, but the true alchemy lay in the dough itself, dyed with iron-rich spring water that oxidized during baking, turning the crumb from gray to gold as it cooled, nature's own allegory of renewal. Serving this cake required choreographed symbolism. It always arrived after dessert, when guests assumed the feast had ended, carried by the youngest kitchen apprentice, representing the future, and the oldest surviving soldier, embodying the past. At the Reconquista's darkest hour, Ferdinand of Aragon staged a legendary spectacle. The cake emerged from an actual smoldering pyre, its sugar phoenix hatching as steam released a hidden compartment filled with live white doves. The birds, trained to circle the hall 3 times before escaping through smoke holes, left the assembly weeping. Even the Ottomans adapted the tradition, their version featuring a phoenix with wings of baklava that unfolded when drizzled with hot syrup, a nod to the empire's ability to absorb losses and sweeten them into expansion. What made this recipe so devastatingly effective was its adaptability to different catastrophes. After military defeats, the cake might be studded with pine nuts, their hardy shells representing unbroken garrisons. Following dynastic crises, chefs would layer marzipan eggs inside the phoenix's chest, each containing a rolled parchment naming an heir. The most chilling variation appeared after the sack of Rome in 1527, when Clement VII's bakers created a phoenix with one wing deliberately undercooked, its sagging form a silent admission of temporary weakness before the cardinal's eyes. This was hope baked in a crucible where every crumb carried the weight of prophecy, and when the last gilded feather was plucked from the platter, the lesson remained. Kingdoms, like phoenixes, were never more dangerous than when you assumed them dead. Decoding the legacy of these 25 recipes isn't just about reconstructing forgotten flavors. It's about peeling back the layers of a hidden language, where saffron threads spelled out alliances and the arrangement of meat on a platter could redraw borders. Consider the humble trencher, that thick slice of stale bread used as a plate in medieval feasts. Most historians dismiss it as mere practicality, but in the hands of a savvy ruler, even this edible canvas became propaganda. When Henry V served his victory feast after Agincourt, the trenchers were baked from flour milled in rebel-held territories. Each bite his nobles took literally consumed the opposition's resources. The brilliance of culinary messaging lay in its deniability. A modern politician's leaked memo sparks outrage, but a 14th-century duke could orchestrate an entire rebellion by simply serving undersalted venison to the right baron. The dish itself remained above reproach. After all, who could prove the absent seasoning wasn't just a kitchen error? This plausible deniability made food the perfect medium for high-stakes communication. The Vatican's secret archives contain coded kitchen ledgers where extra garlic meant papal troops were mobilizing, while lightly sweetened signaled treasury shortages. What fascinates most isn't the extravagance of these meals, but their surgical precision. Take the recurring motif of enclosed foods: pies, stuffed roasts, gilded eggs. Each represented the medieval worldview, Power came from controlling what remained unseen. When Ferdinand of Aragon wanted to intimidate Granadan emissaries, he served a pigeon pie that erupted with live birds when cut, a fluttering metaphor for how Christian forces could appear from seemingly impregnable walls. The same principle applied to subtler dishes. Almond milk's purity hid the fact that its production required enslaving entire groves of trees to human will, their bitter kernels transformed through relentless processing. The true testament to this culinary language's effectiveness, its echoes in modern statecraft. Today's leaders might not serve boar heads, but state dinners still follow unspoken rules: the length of a toast, the seating arrangement, even the choice between local wines or foreign vintages. When a 21st century president serves steak well done to a visiting vegetarian prime minister, the message transcends mere rudeness. It's heir to 1,000 years of edible rhetoric. What these 25 recipes ultimately reveal is that power has always been a performance, and the dining table its most intimate stage. From Charlemagne's roasted lions to Elizabeth I's virginity-themed sugar banquets, every meal was a microcosm of the realm itself, carefully spiced, meticulously plated, and utterly inescapable. The ingredients have changed, but the recipe for influence remains startlingly familiar. Take 1 part theater, 2 parts psychological insight, and simmer for centuries until the lines between sustenance and strategy dissolve completely. From peacocks to phoenixes, each recipe we've explored was a bite-sized piece of history, encoding messages that shaped empires. These dishes were more than meals. They were manifestos, treaties, and threats served on silver platters. Imagine the shockwaves sent through a banquet hall when a ruler shattered a sugar sculpture shaped like a rival's crest, or the quiet dread that followed a single under-seasoned dish signaling royal displeasure. Every ingredient carried weight, every presentation choice a calculated move in the grand chessboard of power. What's truly remarkable is how these culinary codes transcended borders and eras. The Byzantine emperor's golden bread and the Aztec ruler's chocolate infused with chili shared the same purpose: to dazzle, intimidate, and bind subjects to the crown. Even the humblest foods could become weapons. A loaf of barley bread served during famine wasn't just sustenance but theater, proof the ruler could endure hardship alongside the people, even if that hardship was optional for the throne. Today, as we uncover their secrets, we're not just learning about medieval kitchens, we're deciphering the universal language of influence. Modern leaders might not serve boars' heads at state dinners, but think of how a president's choice to eat street food or fine dining still sends deliberate signals. The medium changes, but the message remains: power is always performing, and every meal is a stage. So the next time you sit down to eat, consider what's unsaid on your plate. That humble apple, it once symbolized temptation in Eden and empire in royal orchards. Your morning coffee, the descendant of a beverage so politically charged, Ottoman sultans once banned it in public. History's flavors linger everywhere, you just have to know how to taste them. If you've enjoyed this journey through the flavors of power, don't forget to subscribe for more historical feasts of knowledge. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which political recipe intrigued you the most? Was it the dove pie's fragile peace or the saffron rice's reckless opulence? Until next time, bon appetit, and remember, every bite has a backstory waiting to be unearthed.